Why don't we go ahead and start? Are you ready, Clara? I'll just give a brief introduction, and I'm Dr. Garcia Bryce. I think probably most of you know me. I'm seeing a few names here I don't recognize, so thank you for being here. One thing I will say is that I put this notice out on Faculty Talk, and there were a number of people who were interested and wanted to have the lecture recorded, and so I think there's a lot of interest in the topic, and it's a pleasure to introduce Clara Roberts, who is just graduating or just graduated or is in the process of graduating. She's done. She has her degree in public history, and she's done a number of interesting things throughout the program. For those of you who are unaware of the program, I'm happy to answer questions, or Dr. Sayak, who's the department head, can answer questions about it. But one thing I do appreciate is that I know there are a number of you here from different departments who have collaborated with public history, and that makes it a much richer program. The topic today is Health Seekers Paradise, Tuberculosis in Alamogordo in southern New Mexico. So please help me welcome Clara Roberts.
Thank you. Stevie, are we good to go on the recording? I don't want to start until we're good. Okay, cool. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, and I realized going through this again that it's a little bit of a misnomer because I talk about all of New Mexico, not just southern New Mexico. But my intention was to focus on southern New Mexico, so that's why I titled it Southern New Mexico. But due to lack of sources, because coronavirus, it's a little bit of everything kind of pieced together. But as Dr. Garcia Bryce said, my title is A Health Seeker's Paradise, Tuberculosis in Alamogordo and Southern New Mexico. So first off, I have a little bit of introduction. So what is tuberculosis, in case anybody doesn't know, and what are sanatoriums, or they're also called sanitariums. It just kind of depends on the source, whether they're spelled with an A or an O. But tuberculosis is also known as consumption, phthisis, and the white plague. It's an infectious disease of the lungs caused by the Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which is a tubercle bacillus. Sorry if I butchered that. Don't know anything about how to pronounce science things. But it also had a huge death toll in the 18th and 19th centuries. Unfortunately, I did not think to get numbers for that, but I'm sure they're available on the internet. And it continues to affect a lot of people today, especially those co-infected with HIV. There is a vaccine now, so that helps kind of control things, but there's still no cure for tuberculosis. So it is still a disease that affects people today. The bacterial cause of the disease was discovered by a German doctor in 1882 by the name of Robert Koch. So after they discovered what the cause was, they could start working on sort of trying to find a cure or trying to prevent it a little bit more. And a vaccine was developed in 1921, but this was not really widely used. It wasn't super effective or just available until after World War II. So the death toll was still pretty high throughout the early 20th century. So during the 1830s, doctors and scientists started to promote a sort of dry climate with fresh air and healthy foods as an attempt to cure the disease, or at least mitigate the symptoms if they couldn't cure it. So this came to develop sanitariums as more of a sort of tuberculosis type facility. They already existed, but they basically now are kind of only associated with TB from what I can kind of gather from the research that I did. So those started becoming more widespread throughout the United States. So they weren't just in New York, which is where they started. And the people that went to the sanatoriums who suffered from tuberculosis were often called lungers. And they began their search for a cure often in the desert climes of New Mexico. And even though their intended purpose wasn't to attract other people, sanatoria in New Mexico were often located near hot springs and other sort of desert attractions. And so they ended up becoming attractive to other people as well, not just people who suffered from tuberculosis. So that sort of helps New Mexico become a little bit more developed because more rich people wanted to come to these fancy resorts to go to the hot springs and things like that. So even though that's not directly related to tuberculosis, that was something interesting that I found in my research. And I think it's important to talk about because that helped with the development in New Mexico. So the role of the Southwest in treating tuberculosis, as I said, doctors were promoting dry climates and healthy lifestyles, which you needed lots of fresh air and areas to walk around, things like that. And so the desert areas that weren't super developed were ideal spots for this to happen. A high altitude was also beneficial, the doctors believe, for people suffering with the lung disease. So New Mexico came to be believed to be an ideal place because of this high altitude and their stable climate. Okay. So railroads and tuberculosis. Railroads in New Mexico began to be developed in the 1860s. So I don't know if this is the first railroad, but the ones that I came across in my research. The Pacific Railroad was established in 1869, and the Santa Fe Railroad was established in the early 1870s. So those both opened the Southwest to more people. It took less time, obviously, to get here on a train than it would traditional ways of transportation in that time. But it wasn't until the 1880s that New Mexico began to be sort of colonized, or sorry, not colonized, sort of inhabited by people that were searching the cure. This was partially because the Wild West was often sort of stigmatized as like the Wild West. We still have that sort of Wild West cliche, I guess you could call it, in like media and stuff. Like people still love to watch Westerns and read Westerns and stuff like that. And so part of the reluctance to kind of come to New Mexico at first, because people wanted to go more to California or Colorado, sort of had to do with that Wild West stereotype. One source I found had a quote that said that a lot of people in the city on the East Coast thought that New Mexico was overrun by Indian bands, crusty old prospectors and lawless renegades and desperados. So because of that stereotype, a lot of people didn't start coming to New Mexico until the 1880s. But the railroads really helped to change this because railroad companies promoted New Mexico as a place to go, especially for the lungers who were searching for a cure. So the railroads opened up the territory, especially places like Las Vegas, New Mexico, and Santa Fe, which obviously are in the north. But they both had luxurious resort-style sanatoriums. The South had kind of smaller ones. But by 1888, health seekers traveling to New Mexico were coming a lot more consistently, and it was said that at least one person on every train that came through had, like each city had at least one person who wanted to come here to find a cure. Eddy, which is now Carlsbad in the Pecos Valley, was also another southern New Mexico location that had sanatoriums, but I don't really talk about that in my paper just due to I didn't have the time or the resources to find a whole lot of information on them. But like I said, railroad companies promoted travel to New Mexico for treatment. So they paid for a lot of promotional materials like flyers, pamphlets, and things like that. So the railroads were really connected to the treatment of tuberculosis in New Mexico. So promoting New Mexico was sort of interesting. This was one of the most interesting things I found in my research. I originally chose this topic because I wanted to do research on a house here in Alamogordo, and I looked up the owner and the original owner, and on Wikipedia it said that he had people who had tuberculosis in his house at some period in time, but it's Wikipedia, obviously, so I couldn't just use that. So I wanted to do research initially to try and find more information on the AP Jackson house and how that played a part in tuberculosis, but I could not find any legitimate information because Wikipedia did not have a citation for that statement, so I have no idea where that came from. But yeah, so that's how I originally came to this topic, because I had to sort of shift from just AP Jackson house to something else. So I decided to do tuberculosis. Sorry, I kind of went on a tangent there, but going back to promotion of New Mexico. Part of New Mexico's promotion of tuberculosis, one scholar, Nancy Owen Lewis, who is one of my main sources for this article, she has a theory that she said she needed to do more research on in the book that I read. But her theory is that a lot of New Mexico's struggle to become a state was associated with there not being enough Anglo people in New Mexico. So the politicians and people involved in approving New Mexico to become a state didn't want them to become a state because there wasn't enough Anglos in the territory. So part of the promotion of New Mexico as a place to cure consumption became sort of a draw to bring more Anglos into the area so that they could win statehood. And one thing that I found in my research, I found some primary sources online that were letters from doctors during the, I believe it was the 1880s, late 1880s. And one doctor, H.G. Wetherell, was clearly the one to think that New Mexico shouldn't become a state because of the lack of Anglo population. And he was pretty blatantly racist about how people were unhygienic and that the Mexicans and Indians in the territory were basically made it a place that was uncivilized and somewhere that an Eastern person from the East Coast would not want to come. And he was basically telling people not to come to New Mexico because of the native populations here. So that was really interesting to me. So I think that's why I put this ulterior motive kind of question mark thing here on this side, because it was really interesting and I was not expecting to find that at all. But I definitely, like, finding these primary sources, I definitely can see how Lewis's theory is definitely, like, has some footing, and I definitely believe that it was a factor. Yeah, so that's an interesting tie between tuberculosis and New Mexico, because it sort of, I never would have thought that tuberculosis would have an effect on New Mexico becoming a state. But thankfully, not all the doctors believe that, and I would probably dare to venture that most doctors didn't feel that way, at the same as Dr. Wetherell. There's another physician, his name's James Roth, who defended southern New Mexico and its inhabitants, and he said basically that he didn't think that Wetherell had actually come here, he was just making things up. Because his experience had been, you know, contrary to what he said, and that it was a really nice place and the people were great. And obviously I'm paraphrasing for him, he didn't use those words, but there were other doctors as well that I had found that were more on the side of James Roth, who were like, no, this is a good place to come. You should come settle here if you're looking for a place to be treated for TB. And so obviously by 1904, more people believed James Roth than the other doctor, Dr. Wetherell, because by 1904, New Mexico was the second highest state to have the most beds that were treating people with tuberculosis, second only to New York. So some notable figures, one of the sources that I had, I believe it was Lewis, talked a lot about men and women who came. They have a list in their book about women who came to New Mexico either for themselves or for a family member or loved one, like a fiance or future spouse. And they came to New Mexico because of them to help them find a cure, and then they stayed even after their symptoms subsided and contributed to the development of the state. So I chose just a few to highlight. Albert B. Fall, that's obviously the infamous New Mexico senator who was the Secretary of the Interior during the Harding administration and was involved in the Teapot Dome scandal. He came to New Mexico for treatment of tuberculosis. And then also Clyde Tingley, who was a former Albuquerque mayor and later New Mexico governor. His fiance had tuberculosis, and that's why he came to the area. Edith Hicks was a woman who had tuberculosis as well, and she became a manager of the Albuquerque Civic Council. The book was written or was published by the Museum of New Mexico, and I think that's why her sources were sort of focused on northern New Mexico people. So unfortunately, I couldn't find a lot of information on people from southern New Mexico. But I did find A.P. Jackson, who, like I said before, unfortunately, I could not ascertain for certain on legitimate sources other than Wikipedia, whether he actually had tuberculosis or if somebody he knew had tuberculosis, and that's why he ended up in Alamogordo. But he was a prominent business owner and beloved community member. I found an obituary, a newspaper obituary, and people clearly respected him and loved him. And I think it's very possible that he did have tuberculosis. He died at the age of 40. So by the time he died, which would have been early 1900s, I think 40 was still kind of young. I don't know for sure, but that seems kind of young to me. So I think it would be a possibility that he did have tuberculosis. And I'm really interested to know whether he does, and I'm hoping that one day I will find out. Unfortunately, well, like I said, when I chose this topic, coronavirus had just hit. I was writing this paper originally in March, and so everything shut down. Thankfully, I got a little bit extra information during the summer when things kind of were not as crazy yet in New Mexico. And the Tuberculosis Basin Museum had opened for a little bit. And I thankfully got some more information from them, but archive information was not readily available, unfortunately. So my sources were a little limited writing this, unfortunately. Tuberculosis also had an impact on society, which I also found really interesting. And I didn't go into super detail into this just because my sources didn't talk a whole lot about it, and due to time and, like I said, research restraints, I couldn't find super detailed information. But some things that were changed was fashion. So women's skirts became shorter because of tuberculosis, so that they didn't drag on the ground and get as much dirt and germs and things on them. So obviously they couldn't wash things as much back then. So having shorter skirts that didn't get as dirty and didn't drag on the ground was one sort of example of fashion and how that was shaped by tuberculosis. And also the regulation of the public was another big one. So spitting in public became banned. There were regulations against that, which kind of goes with the skirt thing. So stop spreading germs a little bit, or at least attempting to. And then this picture I have on this left-hand side is a picture of what they call the sleeping porch. And this architectural sort of style or addition became popular because of tuberculosis. So one of the sort of treatments that doctors told patients of tuberculosis to do was to use a sleeping porch so that they could sleep in the open air. And that was supposed to help heal their lungs a little bit, to consume the air that's fresh and not as stifling as sleeping inside with all your windows closed. So this architectural style sort of evolved from the promotion of it because of tuberculosis treatments. So now I'm going to go a little bit more into some specific sanatoriums and what I could find on them. So this picture is of Dr. Boyd Sanitarium in General Van Patten's Mountain Camp, which is in Las Cruces. So this is, if anybody's been to the Dripping Springs Natural Area, you'll probably recognize this. This is all that's left. I think it would have been a lot bigger originally. I don't think I couldn't find any pictures of it ever, like the whole thing. So I don't know if we don't have any or if I just couldn't find them. They might just not be accessible online. They might not be digital. And with the most archives being closed while I was doing this, it was a little hard to find information. But this is one of 10 sanatoriums located in southern New Mexico. And it's, like I said, nestled in the heart of the Oregon Mountains. It's really cool. If you haven't been up there and you're in the Las Cruces area, I suggest to go to Dripping Springs if it's open. It's just a little walkway that's gravel. It's not like an intense hike or anything. But it's really cool. So it had 16 guest rooms, a dining room, and a concert hall. I believe this is, yeah, this label is, so this would have been the kitchen and the dining room. So the concert hall and all of the guest rooms are no longer standing. But it seems like it was pretty big for the time. It was established in the late 19th century and it was acquired by Boyd in 1917. And then he passed it on, or he sold it to a Las Cruces physician named T.C. Sexton. But unfortunately, it was closed in 1925. So a lot of the sanatoriums had pretty short time spans. They didn't last very long. I wasn't able to do a whole lot of research on why that was, but I think it had a lot to do with people were becoming more aware of how contagious tuberculosis was. So more people were being wary about having a lot of people close together and sort of sharing spaces with people who didn't have tuberculosis. So I would guess that probably has to be a factor, but like I said, I haven't done any research on why they sort of fell out of favor. So I can't say for sure. Okay, so moving on to Alamogordo. There were several sanatoriums in Alamogordo. So these included the Alamogordo Cottage Sanatorium, founded by W.A. Reed in 1908, and the Mountain Air Sanatorium, established by the National Children's Tuberculosis Society in 1913. So that was primarily of children, but they did also have adults as patients as well. And the sanatorium that I mostly focus on is called the Fraternal City Sanatorium. It was the most successful in the Alamogordo area. The other ones didn't last very long, like maybe 5 years at most. This one didn't last too much longer than that, unfortunately, but it has a lot more information on it, I think, just because the documentation was more thorough. But it was established in 1907, and originally there was a competition to try and see where this sanatorium was going to be located in New Mexico by the American Cooperative Sanatorium Association. And Las Vegas, New Mexico was originally chosen as the location, but because financial backing from the railroad up there fell through and the people of Las Vegas were not, they, for whatever reason, didn't want the sanatorium, so they didn't really support it. So because of that, the deal basically just fell through, and Alamogordo citizens and organizations from this area decided, well, we want this to happen. So they sort of kind of got behind building a sanatorium in their area. So the project was mostly taken over by 3 businessmen involved with the National Fraternal Sanatorium. And that's why it was called the Fraternal City Sanatorium originally. So they took over the project because it was important to their community. And they also felt that Alamogordo's south central location and altitude were amenable. It had the ideal elevation. So doctors thought that 5,000 feet was too high for tuberculosis bacteria to survive. That was incorrect, but that was what they believed. So that was why high altitude was sort of a priority for treating tuberculosis. And the city also, because it was developed as a railroad town, had a lot of amenities that other places didn't. So it had electric lights, it had laid out streets in, specific laid out streets. They weren't just sort of set up wherever. And they also had a water system. So they thought that all of these sort of modern amenities would attract Eastern city dwellers who maybe didn't want to live in the middle of nowhere in a desert. So like, well, we have these things that a lot of other cities don't. So hopefully that will attract more people to come to Alamogordo. It was renamed the Alamogordo Sanitarium in 1909, but unfortunately it burned down in 1912. None of the residents were killed or injured as far as I could find, but the building was never repaired. So unfortunately it was also very short-lived, but it does have the most information available about it. So as I said earlier, I really wanted to do this project on AP Jackson originally, but I couldn't find a whole lot on tuberculosis and him as a connection. But he was a prominent businessman and president of the Jackson Galbraith Foxworth Lumber Company, which operated lumber yards in Alamogordo, Tucumcari, Santa Rosa, and multiple locations in Texas. And he greatly contributed to the local economy of both Alamogordo and the other areas where the lumber was. And he helped the Alamogordo citizens sort of come together and save the sanatorium in, you know, either monetary ways or just being sort of a pillar of the community. All right, so I have a couple pictures here from our NMSU archives that I found. So this was the fraternal sanatorium. It was pretty big. And I'm not sure how they achieved this because this looks amazing in the middle of the desert, but I can definitely see why that would be appealing to a lot of people to want to come here to, you know, relax and try and recuperate with all of this pretty scenery and the mountains behind them. All right, so in conclusion, New Mexico was improved a lot because of tuberculosis in ways that I never would have even thought of. It had a massive impact on the state of New Mexico. Patients that recovered and chose to adopt the state as their new home after they recovered. One of the sources said that they filled a vacuum of economic and professional leadership in New Mexico in a time when there was not much other incentive to sort of come and join, you know, the communities here already set up in New Mexico. So that was definitely, obviously it wasn't a good reason because they were sick and that couldn't have been, you know, pleasant. But after they did come to New Mexico, it did help them a lot, though it didn't cure them, but it did help them opposed to living in, you know, rainy and really unhealthy urban environments. So they did feel better, so that helped a lot as well. And then Alamogordo was brought together as a community in support of the sanatorium, which I think demonstrates the power of collectively working toward one goal. Obviously, I didn't plan for this topic to be explored during a pandemic, but that's what happened. So there were some interesting sort of parallels, I think, that I connected, especially towards the end when I converted this into an article. Originally, I wrote this as a marker justification for my interpreting historical places class. And so I turned that into an article. And when I was converting it into an article these past several months, I was like, wow, there's actually kind of a lot that connects to like what's happening now. So I think it'll be really interesting in the future to see like, oh, how does coronavirus change? You know, does it change fashion? Does it change, you know, public policy, health policies? I'm sure it's going to change public health policies. But yeah, so it'll be interesting to see the parallels between how tuberculosis influenced sort of the future in architecture and things like that, and how coronavirus will influence things in 5-10 years and plus. And then finally, I think that this story offers a bit of hope for us, like I said, in a time where disease has touched many of our lives in a personal way. I think the story of lungers can give hope in a world that is living in a time that can often feel very hopeless, and we feel powerless in these situations where we don't know what's happening and everything's changing every single day, and it's it can be frustrating and hard to deal with. But I think that learning or hearing these stories of these lungers that came to Mexico despite their illness and kind of got a new lease on life really gave me hope. So hopefully it will do the same for you. I think it shows that eventually respite will come. But until then, we have to do all that we can to band together and support our communities and each other in what we can do for searching for aid, just as the Alamogordo citizens in 1905 committed to the building of the Fraternal City Sanatorium to help those lungers searching for a cure, whether those were the people already in their community or neighboring communities or total strangers that they were willing to sort of welcome into their community in the hopes that they could find a cure for them. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Clara. Before I open it up for questions, just briefly, where is it that your article is going to be published?
Sorry, in the New Mexico, sorry, I forget the name, the Southern New Mexico Review, I believe. It's the publication from Doña Ana County Historical Society.
Okay, great. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Let's open it up for questions now. I don't know if you want to, did you want to, oh, there we go, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Jeff.
At some conference, someone said that the people who could afford to live far from home for years at a time in sanitaria without working came from more prosperous backgrounds than people typically did, and that therefore the folks with tuberculosis brought money into a very poor frontier. Did you see anything in what you read that might support that?
I think so. I didn't really go into it a whole lot, just because my intention, like I said, in writing the marker justification, didn't necessarily go too deep into that sort of area in research, but I do think Lewis talks about that in her book. I definitely think that was a factor, and I think that's why it was so important to New Mexico, because they did bring in money that would otherwise wouldn't have ever come here. I didn't find anything specifically that I can remember, but yes, I think that definitely was a huge factor. Yes.
Introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Jack Davis. I'm Sylvia's husband. I'm a retired instructor from DACC, and I also taught at NMSU and
Biology.
in biology. And following up on that question, it would seem like if moneyed people were coming out here, it might have a cultural influence. You know, maybe things would, any evidence that we got outside cultural influences, like, you know, theaters or plays or anything, libraries, through this, because in those days, territorial days, we were kind of a little bit behind the curve in a lot of things, probably.
Yeah, there was that list that I was talking about in the book by Lewis. It's called Chasing the Cure in New Mexico. She has a pretty long list of people that came to New Mexico and stayed in New Mexico because of tuberculosis. And there's a lot of artists, journalists, just all sorts of people, professionals from different walks of life and different careers. So yeah, kind of like similar answer to the one before. I didn't personally do a whole lot of research on that area just because it wasn't something that I sort of thought to go in that direction, or sort of couldn't do that because of time restrictions. But yeah, I definitely think that there probably is a connection. I know Alamogordo is definitely more, from my experience, because I grew up in Alamogordo, and then I went to NMSU, so I've been there for 6 years, and I definitely think the cultures are very, very different. The Alamogordo culture seems much more quote unquote Anglo than Las Cruces. So I think there's definitely something to Lewis's argument there as well. Like, it kind of seemed to be settled more. I think that obviously has more to do with the Air Force Base being in Alamogordo nowadays. But I don't know in between if that would have stayed consistent or not. Yeah, in my personal experience, it definitely seems to be more influenced by that.
It also makes me wonder if, you know, during that time frame in northern New Mexico, the Harvey houses were getting up together and of course train was becoming a tourism thing. And you didn't work on northern New Mexico that much, but it makes me think, I wonder how much influence TV had on northern New Mexico across the I-40 US 66 corridor.
Yeah, I don't know. Unfortunately, I didn't get that detailed in my research. Future project.
Well, there's a book by Victoria Dye called All Aboard in Santa Fe, and it actually talks about that topic. It connects the train with tourism.
But having sick people tourism, I mean, CB tourism is kind of wondering if they got involved in that as well.
Whether they got what?
Whether Harvey House or the railroad got involved in TB tourism.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I just taught a course on transportation and trains, and we read a little bit about it. It's not my area of expertise, but they did talk about TB, but I don't know to what extent the Harvey houses did. But it does raise another interesting question I was thinking about, because the trains also were the beginning of sort of a national market and national advertising here in the US. And I would think it would be interesting. I don't know if you saw any of this, but one would think if they were trying to attract people that one would be able to find advertisements in other parts of the country.
Yes, yeah, the railroad companies paid for promotion of New Mexico as a cure, like a place to come for a cure. I unfortunately couldn't get any of the pamphlets, but I know they exist. They just aren't digitized. So I think El Paso has some, maybe somewhere in Arizona, and I'm pretty sure UNM also had some, because I found them in research. I found the finding aids for them, but unfortunately they weren't digitized and the archives were all closed, so I couldn't access them. But I know they exist, so it definitely played a part in the promotion for sure.
But you don't know whether it would have just been in newspapers.
I don't think so, because it said pamphlet, so I think that would be like an individual thing by itself, but I don't know for sure because I wasn't able to see it. But I think they did sort of everything you would do to promote places, especially because, I mean, it benefited them as well, obviously, because you'd have to buy train tickets to get there. So they were big helps in promoting. Dylan, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate your presentation, and I feel your pain as far as all the archives not being open. I know that's been a struggle for all of us doing research right now, but I appreciate your perseverance in putting this together. I had a couple questions. One, did you come across specifically in Alamogordo any kind of backlash about people saying, hey, why are we bringing people here who have this illness? Even if it is going to economically benefit us, maybe we should stop and think about putting that into our community. And then second, when a person was there at the sanatorium, what did they actually do? What was their day-to-day life like, and what was the cost? Particularly, did you come across the cost for what it was in Alamogordo?
I did. Of course, you asked the question of the thing that I don't have printed up. It's in my article somewhere. Actually, is it? I don't know. Yes, there are sources that say how much it is. I can't remember now how much it was. I have a little pamphlet that I found from the Tuberculosis Basin that had the cost. I want to say it was maybe like $5 to $10 a day, which I'm sure back then was still quite a lot. But yeah, so it did cost a good amount, and there are things that you can find that tell you how much it is. I lost my train of thought. Day-to-day stuff. So a few of them listed activities. They mostly were encouraged to take long walks, to not do anything too strenuous, but to still exercise. That was a big thing, was they wanted you to eat healthy food and to exercise in the outside fresh air. So those were that I can remember from my research, those were the main things. I don't know that they had, some of them might have still had jobs. I'm not 100% sure. But But yes, and then what was your first question? Backlash, right?
Yeah, yeah. If there was any kind of campaign to say, hey, we don't want this here in our community.
Not that I remember from Alamogordo specifically, but I do know that was sort of one of the issues with the people in Las Vegas was at the point that the the Fraternal City Sanatorium was trying to be built, that more research and more information was coming out about how contagious tuberculosis was, because before that point, they thought it was sort of just a genetic type thing, or like oh, it's just you, like for whatever reason you're defective, for lack of a better word. So they didn't realize that it was, an actual disease. But once they discovered that, and then they were doing more research and they realized how contagious it was, people did begin to sort of be like, hey, we don't really want them here. But I couldn't find anything specifically in Alamogordo. The book, I believe it was Lewis. She talks a little bit about that. I don't remember if she goes into a lot of detail, but she does address it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I mean, germs as disease agents wasn't actually discovered till 1880. And TB is a lot different from most diseases. I mean, for most people, it's a chronic disease that you have, and that sort of feeds into what you were saying about it's not an illness, it's something wrong with you, right? Because it's like asthma. People who have TB often have it for life, and it doesn't kill them, but it just makes them miserable from time to time. And so it makes sense what you're saying, that they didn't really recognize it as being a germ-related type of disease. And it's still today one of the hardest diseases to treat because it's resistant naturally to most antibiotics.
Mm-hmm.
And so even after antibiotics were discovered, that didn't really push TB. And then in 1918, we had the 1918 flu pandemic, which is also respiratory, which might have, also influenced people's attitudes about receiving sick tourists.
Mm-hmm.
And also you were saying that the altitude can affect, which is quite interesting, I didn't know, that when the higher the altitude, obviously, the less oxygen, right? And they were gonna have more problems breathing, but still they thought at that time that the air was more pure, let's say,
but they thought of it as being like asthma, being like a genetic condition, not a disease. And so a person with any lung issue is going to need more oxygen. And when you go to high elevation, you actually have less oxygen. So their actual treatment shows that they didn't really understand at all, what was the actual problem. Mm-hmm. They were just grasping at straws. And sometimes people got better and sometimes they didn't, right? So they never really had, until germs were discovered as a disease agent, they had no idea, because TB just doesn't fit your typical infectious disease. It's just very different.
Yeah, that was interesting. I definitely would like to do more research to look into that and see. Yeah, I didn't find a whole lot on that specifically.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Clara. I'm Teddy. I work at the archives, and we're really proud of Clara. She interned for us at the archives, and she did a wonderful job, and we're happy and pleased that it's gone on and did so well.
Thank you.
But I had a question for you, Clara. You mentioned that I thought you mentioned right before your presentation that you had either lived in the Jackson house. Is that what you said? Did I mishear you?
I haven't lived there, no. I'm born and raised in Alamogordo, so I just knew about the house.
Oh, okay. Okay. I wondered what that was like because I Googled it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, no, I wished. I've always wanted to go in there, but I've never been able to. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but I don't know who owns it, so I'm not sure what's going on with it. Right now, it's still standing. They were doing work on it last time I drove past it, but but yeah, unfortunately, I've never been in there.
Where is it located in Alamogordo, more or less?
It's I don't know if anybody's familiar with Alamogordo, but it's on 9th Street, going towards College. So it's pretty close to College. If you've been here recently and you know where the chiropractor's office is, on the corner of 10th Street and College.
Oh, okay.
It's like a block across and a little bit down from there.
I like the part about the Tingleys because I'm not from Albuquerque, so I never really knew much about them. But of course, I know there's a Carrie Tingley Foundation Hospital, or was in Albuquerque for a long time. And I imagine that that's related to Clyde Tingley.
I would assume so.
Carrie Tingley, yeah.
Laura, that's the sanatorium, the fraternal one, that one's in Alamogordo, is that right?
Yes.
I don't know if I missed this, but is that still, I mean, is that building still there?
No, it's completely, it's gone. But there are photos in the NMSU archives of it. There's actually quite a few. So I was able to get some, which was kind of surprising actually, because I couldn't find photos for anything else. But yeah, it was at the base of the mountains. So again, I don't know if anybody's familiar with sort of the trails in the Alamogordo area, but it was at the base of the mountains where the Alamo Canyon is. So the sort of northeast-ish, I think that's right. But yeah, is at the base of the mountains, and it was after the fire. I think they didn't have the money to fix it, and so they kind of just left it. And then it was eventually, what was left of it was kind of raided for wood and, you know, parts, and just kind of taken and used for other things. So there's nothing at all that's left of it, unfortunately. I think it was pretty much mostly wood, so I think that's also why. But yeah, there's nothing left of it, unfortunately.
And with the one at Dripping Springs, how much documentation is there? Is there much at all?
I couldn't find a whole lot.
By that place when I went up there for the first time.
Yeah.
How much we know about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't focus on that. I added the Boyd Sanatorium and the sort of Las Cruces when I converted it into an article. That wasn't originally in my my nomination research. So I didn't get to do a whole lot of digging on that, just because I was also doing my thesis and I was converting this into an article. So I was a little bit preoccupied with my thesis research, but I did find a book at the Tularosa Museum, and it has sort of a paragraph or so of information. So there is a little bit. I don't know primary research wise, again, because all archives are pretty much closed or very, very limited. So I don't know, we might have information on it at the NMSU archives, I don't know, but I couldn't find anything too detailed, unfortunately, on Boyd Sanatorium. But yeah, it's really interesting for sure.
Well, I guess if there are no more questions, we can all go back to what we do all the time, which is sit around at home, huh?
Yep.
Waiting for the next Zoom meeting. Well, thank you, and good luck with
Thank you.
your future endeavors. Enjoy your vacation and stay in touch. Let us know where you
I will. Thank
where
you.
you end up going and what you do. Thank you.
And for anybody who came in kind of late, this is being recorded. So if you would like to watch, just let me know and I can email it to you. I will put my email in the chat. I'm trying to think really quick how I can do this, but I'll put my email in the chat and stay on for a minute in case anybody wants me to email it to you. So I know some of you came in kind of halfway through.
Good job, Clara. Keep in
Thank
touch,
you.
okay? And good to see all of you.
It's good to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Very good. Thank you.
And do email it to me, because then I can forward it on to these two other people that are
Okay, yeah, I'll do that. I'll just have Stevie email it to me, and then that way, if somebody contacts me, I can send it to them as well, and then I'll forward it to you.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everybody. Congratulations.